On May 7, 2026, Ibrahim Traore completed the encirclement of Kidal, a city that had been under rebel control for 12 days without sending a single AS soldier across the Malian border. 0 troops. No border crossed. The ring closed anyway. The international press had spent those 12 days writing about hesitation, about a leader who went quiet while his neighbor burned, about an alliance that, when tested, chose silence over action. They were watching the wrong story. While analysts ran the hesitation narrative, while every headline framed the stillness, as Paralysis Traore was executing the most precisely sequenced counter-operation the A's had ever run. He had approved 15,000 troops in mid-April, weeks before the attack began, weeks before the world knew an attack was coming. The silence was not a symptom. It was the strategy. If you have ever looked at an African leader's response to crisis and assumed that stillness meant weakness, this video is the assumption they were counting on you to make. Kidal is surrounded. Not stormed, not negotiated. Surrounded by Malian forces, with logistical and intelligence coordination that reports reviewed show extended across the AS coalition framework, all while 0 alliance of Sahel states ground troops ever crossed a single meter into Malian sovereign territory. That confirmation came on May 7. Traore News Afrique documented it. MD24 News TV documented it. The ring was closed, but for 12 days before that, the international narrative ran a different story entirely. Every major outlet, every defense analyst with a platform, every geopolitical commentator who covers the Sahel framed the same thing, the same way the A's was frozen. The alliance was silent. Burkina Faso had positioned 15,000 troops and then done nothing with them. The language shifted from cautious to hesitant to, by day 10, openly calling it a failure, a first real test of alliance credibility, and the alliance blinked. That was the narrative. Here is what the narrative was actually designed to produce. The containment architecture, the network of financial, diplomatic, legal, and military instruments that has managed African sovereign space for decades, had engineered a trap with 2 sides. Both sides were visible, if you knew where to look. Neither side was ever reported. Side A. AS deploys ground troops across the Malian border. Within hours, the headline writes itself: Alliance of Sahel States invades Mali. Legal mechanisms activate. The Economic Community of West African States convenes. International courts receive filings. What follows is not a military response but a procedural one, stretching across years of injunctions, sanctions reviews, and diplomatic isolation. The containment architecture does not need to win the battle. It needs the paperwork. That paperwork becomes the cage. Side B. AS does not send troops. The same architecture, the same institutions, the same editorial networks frames the restraint as paralysis, hesitation, weakness, silence while a neighbor burns. The narrative does the work that troops would have done. Credibility erodes. Internal political pressure builds. And the next time a crisis emerges inside the alliance, the hesitation story is already on file, ready to replay. Either side of the trap produces the same outcome for the same system. Traore walked into neither side. Records indicate the Burkina Faso military coordination began not at the moment of the Kidal encirclement, but significantly earlier, a sequenced operation built on the principle that presence replaces crossing. The troops massed. The supply lines were documented. The signal was sent through channels that every intelligence service in the region reads in real time. And the border was never crossed, because crossing was never the point. The encirclement was the message, delivered without the pretext. 12 days of international analysis, and the analysts were scoring the wrong game. They were counting troops at the border and calling it inaction. They were measuring hesitation by the absence of movement, which means they missed the movement entirely, the movement happening inside Mali, coordinated through frameworks that didn't require AS boots on Malian soil to function. According to force disposition reporting reviewed by regional security monitors, the 15,000 troops were not a deployment waiting to happen. They were a sealing the visible boundary that made every calculation inside Mali shift, without a single order being executed across international lines. That is what containment architecture cannot absorb. Not defiance, not confrontation. The thing it cannot process is a move that refuses both options it prepared for. But what analysts consistently missed, even the ones tracking the AS force numbers closely, even the ones with access to the Bamako logistics data, was hiding inside a single question nobody thought to ask out loud. When exactly were those 15,000 troops approved? According to the Council on Foreign Relations, the AS expanded its joint force from 5,000 to 15,000 troops, beginning in mid-April weeks, before the first shot was fired on April 25th. Not after before, that authorization did not happen in response to the attack. It happened while the attack was still being planned. And what Traore was doing in those 12 days after Kidal fell, while every headline called it, silence, is the part of this story that changes everything you just heard. Mid-April. That is the answer. The Council on Foreign Relations documented the AS troop authorization in mid-April, weeks before the attack, not after the crisis, before it. That is not a reactive deployment. That is anticipatory positioning. Someone inside the AS command structure did not predict the attack. They expected it. That distinction matters more than it sounds. A reaction scrambles. Anticipation plans, and if Traore was already positioned before the assault began, then the encirclement was never a decision made under pressure. It was the execution of a plan assembled in calm, with time to think clearly and aim precisely. The question that follows is the obvious one. What, exactly, had he already seen? The first signal came through the intelligence layer. Regional analysts who reviewed the files noted that Russia received a 72-hour warning before the attack. 72 hours, a full 3 days to intervene, redirect, or alert, and they did not act on it. There are only two explanations. Either the warning channel was compromised, information arrived, but institutional trust did not survive long enough to trigger a response, or the non-response was deliberate. Someone decided the attack could proceed. Either interpretation lands in the same place. The intelligence architecture surrounding the AS had a structural gap. Gaps leave traces. Traore read the trace, and then he started counting. The second signal was physical, considerably harder to explain away. Africa Corps, formerly operating under the Wagner brand, now formally absorbed under Russian Ministry of Defense contract, per an African News report published February 21, 2026, documenting the SF reabsorption, withdrew from Kidal, not under fire, not under pressure, under flay escort. Russian equipment was left behind. According to the Wikipedia record of the 2026 Mali offensives, this was a negotiated exit, not a chaotic route, a handoff arranged in advance, on agreed terms. Negotiated exits produce documentation, timelines, communication records, authorization signatures, the kind of paper trail that survives even when the people who made the deal would prefer it didn't. Someone coordinated that withdrawal. Someone wrote the terms. Whoever found those documents first would hold something the containment architecture had not planned to give up. The third signal was linguistic. After the attack, Genim released a public statement. The language they chose was extraordinary. They spoke of peaceful transition, of a common front with political parties. Genim is an Al-Qaeda affiliate. Jihadist organizations do not reach for the grammar of democratic coalition politics. They do not frame objectives in the language of electoral legitimacy and parliamentary consensus. That vocabulary belongs to a different kind of operator. Someone had rewritten their script, someone with access deep enough inside the organization to redirect its public messaging, and a motive to need it redirected. 3 signals, not a pattern of escalation, a pattern of orchestration, a compromised warning channel that left a gap in the architecture, a negotiated Russian withdrawal that left a paper trail, a jihadist organization speaking the language of political parties. None of these required a military response. Each one was an intelligence case with sources, with documentation, with the kind of evidentiary logic that does not survive artillery fire. You cannot shell your way to discovering who arranged the Kidal handoff. You cannot bomb your way to the authorization chain that rewrote Genim's public statement. The containment architecture had built every scenario around Traore acting like a general. He was behaving like a prosecutor who already knew where the evidence was buried. Building that case required the one thing no ground offensive could provide: time, clean, deliberate, controllable time where the evidence stayed intact and the witnesses stayed in place. The 12-day encirclement was not the pause before the action. The 12 days were the action, and that case required one thing: no military operation could provide time, which is exactly what Goita's silence gave him. Al Jazeera confirmed it. Assimi Goita disappeared from public view for 96 hours following the initial assault. No press conferences, no state television, no statement of command. And in that same window, while the head of the Malian state was silent, Ibrahim Traore was visible. He issued the AS statement. He coordinated the air response. He appeared. That contrast was not accidental, because a leader who acts before an ally's command structure has stabilized does not win the crisis. He inherits it. Traore understood the sequence, and the sequence required him to wait. April 25th. The attack was 12 hours old. Ibrahim Traore was not in Ouagadougou. He was not at a forward command post. He was in Bobo Dioulasso, the commercial capital, 400 kilometers southwest, and he was framing the crisis before anyone else got to name it. The statement he issued, covered by News Central TV, did not call it an incursion. It did not call it a military emergency. He called it a monstrous conspiracy. That word choice was precise. Conspiracy implies coordination, planning, external architecture beyond local capacity. He was not describing what had happened. He was indexing what he already knew. The framing was the first exhibit. Then Goita went silent, 96 hours, 4 full days. Al Jazeera confirmed the absence: no press conferences, no state television appearances, no command statement from Bamako. The international press filled the gap with the obvious interpretation. Leadership paralysis in Mali, institutional fracture inside the AS, a coalition too fragile to respond. They were wrong. Every hour of Goita's silence was giving Traore exactly what the intelligence case required. Operational space. The absence of a Malian command signature meant no action taken in that window could be misread as joint aggression. Traore was visible and working. Goita was deliberately invisible. May 1st. ACE air campaigns launched over Kidal, Gao, and Menaka. African News confirmed the strikes. No ground troops crossed the border, not one. The air response had a military effect, but that was secondary. Its primary function was architectural. It demonstrated that the alliance could apply sustained pressure from entirely within its own sovereign territory. Without triggering the foreign invasion pretext the containment architecture had been holding in reserve. The trap that had been set in mid-April, send troops and lose the narrative, hold back and lose the ground, had a third option. Apply pressure from altitude. Leave the border intact. Let the legal argument collapse before it could be made. The sequence logic here is critical. A leader who forces action before an ally's command structure stabilizes does not win the crisis. He inherits it. Every broken coalition in modern African military history has shattered at that exact point, the moment one partner moved before the other was structurally ready to follow. Traore understood this. He did not push Bamako. He waited for the signal that Bamako was whole. May 4th. Colonel Assimi Goita read a decree on state radio. He appointed himself Minister of Defense. General Umar Diarra was named Delegated Minister. Al Jazeera covered both appointments within the hour. The international framing was governance consolidation, a junta tightening its grip. That was the surface read. The operational read was simpler. Mali's command chain had been restored. The last structural ambiguity inside the AS had been resolved. There was now a single, named, accountable military authority in Bamako. The encirclement could complete without producing a political orphan. Remember those 15,000 troops approved in mid-April, weeks before the attack. They had been waiting for exactly this signal. Not the assault, not the fall of Kidal, the restoration of the Malian command chain that would make the encirclement politically clean. The authorization was anticipatory. The execution was patient. The timing was precise. May 7th. Kidal encircled. Traore News Afrique and MD24 News TV both confirmed the closure. Kidal encerclé. 12 days, 0 border crossings. The ring was closed not by marching into Mali, but by making it operationally impossible to function outside it, by controlling the corridors, the supply lines, the air, and the political authorization that let all three hold simultaneously. The fact that you followed that sequence from the force numbers approved in mid-April, to the air campaign that held the border clean, to the Goita appointment that made the encirclement politically legible, means you already understand something. Most international observers are actively choosing to look past. This was not improvised crisis management. The architecture was already standing before the attack began, and when the ring closed on May 7th, the phone started ringing from capitals that had spent a decade insisting the AES model was too fractured to scale, too ideological to govern, too dependent on Russian cover to survive independent pressure. They had their answer now, and they were not calling to congratulate. They were calling because the doctrine had just proved itself, and they needed to know how far it intended to travel. Regional observers have documented formal requests from at least 7 neighboring governments in the weeks following the encirclement. Not requests for military assistance, not diplomatic congratulations, requests for membership, for alignment, for the specific framework that allowed a coalition of landlocked, formerly occupied nations to close a ring around a jihadist stronghold in 12 days without crossing a sovereign border. When Kidal fell on April 25th, the headline was, AES has failed its first real test. When Kidal was surrounded 12 days later, 7 governments sent formal inquiries. That is not a coincidence. That is a signal. They called it encirclement without invasion. That phrase matters. It is not a description of what happened. It is a doctrine tested, executed, and confirmed on May 7th over the skies of northern Mali. Air power, intelligence coordination, political sequencing. No AES, ground troops crossed the Malian border. None. The ring closed from the outside in, using altitude and signal and timing, not occupation, and that distinction is not semantic. It is the entire architecture of the operation. Here is what the doctrine denies simultaneously. It denies the occupation narrative. With no AES forces on Malian soil, there is no AES invades headline, no footage of foreign soldiers in Kidal's streets, no UN-Security Council session opening with satellite images of troops in position. The containment architecture needed that headline. It had prepared for it. It did not get it. And it denies the pretext. No occupation means no legal justification for external forces to return. The frameworks that sustained foreign military presence across the Sahel, the counter-terrorism mandates, the partnership agreements, the protection clauses, every one requires a predicate, a territorial violation, an escalation, something that can be named and cited in a resolution. Traore's doctrine produced nothing that could be named. The ring closed. The border held. The mechanism had no lever to pull. According to comparative regional security analysis, this is the first AES action conducted at full operational scale without foreign permission, foreign basing rights, or foreign funding. No partnership framework referenced. No multilateral mandate. It runs on regional sovereignty and an intelligence architecture built quietly over 18 months, while the world watched the rhetoric, not the infrastructure. Now consider the ground beneath Kidal. Reports reviewed from independent geological surveys indicate the northern Mali basin contains mapped uranium and lithium deposits comparable to the highest value Saharan resource zones under active assessment. Documents suggest informal extraction does not pause during conflict, it accelerates. A territory in armed instability cannot audit its own soil. Contractors move faster when no functioning state institution is asking questions. The disruption is not a side effect of the fighting. In many documented cases, the disruption is the operating condition those networks require. The encirclement changes that condition. It does not end extraction, but it closes the controlled instability that informal networks depend on. The ring is not just a military perimeter. It is an audit. Records indicate France and the United Nations combined sustained over a decade of military presence in the Sahel, thousands of troops, hundreds of positions, expenditure measured in the tens of billions. During that period, territory under jihadist control expanded, not marginally, consistently, measurably, year over year. The containment architecture's own mandate was counterterrorism. Its own metric was territorial control. By its own metric, it failed across 12 years. AES used air power, intelligence, encirclement. 0 ground troops crossed the Malian border. The doctrine produced the opposite result in 12 days. That comparison is not triumphalism, it is data. And that data is why the containment architecture cannot let the doctrine stand without response. The question it raises is not military. It is existential for every arrangement that sustained informal influence across the continent for 60 years. If Burkina Faso, Mali, And Niger can close that ring, can demonstrate that sovereignty at scale is achievable without external troops, without foreign basing rights. Without the architecture's permission then, the informal extraction model loses its operating environment. Not just in the Sahel. Everywhere that model runs on the same logic. The 7 governments that sent formal membership inquiries were not calling because they admired a military result. They were calling because they needed to understand the framework, whether it was transferable, whether it scaled, whether the doctrine could travel. That is not a military result. That is a political one, and it forces a question that every government in West Africa is now being asked to answer out loud, on the record, with the cameras running. 12 days. 0 troops across a single border. 7 governments on the phone asking how it was done. That is the sequence. And it proved 3 things. 3 things that do not belong in a press release, because they are structural. Sovereignty does not require foreign permission to defend itself. Stillness can be strategy. The most precise action is sometimes the one that looks like inaction. And the doctrine scales. 7 nations have already sent formal inquiries, not to congratulate a military result, but to understand whether the framework travels. Those 3 sentences are the architecture of what happened. Not the explosion, not the press conference, the architecture. Here is what I want you to notice. You followed this from the force numbers 15,000 troops approved before a single shot, to the Goïta appointment, to the 96 hours of silence, to the ring closing around Kidal in 12 days. You read the 3 intelligence signals. You understood why 0 troops crossing the border was the most powerful move available. You tracked the sequence all the way to 7 formal membership inquiries, landing on a desk in Ouagadougou. That means you already understand something the mainstream press will spend years trying to explain incorrectly. You have the frame. You read the silence, right? The world called it hesitation. You know what it actually was. If this video gave you the frame, the headlines never did press like. Not as a gesture, as a record that this analysis exists. That someone built it carefully, verified every sequence, and that someone watched it all the way through. Share this with someone who was told the 12 days of silence was weakness. Give them the vocabulary to read the sequence correctly. The difference between weakness and precision is the frame. You now have it. Pass it on, and in the comments drop the plan, your country, and one decision Traore made in those 12 days that you think the containment architecture never anticipated. Let's see who followed the sequence all the way through. One more thing. Traore named something on May 7th. Not a military result, a system. The specific funding architecture that made the original attack possible, the mechanism the doctrine was built to expose, not just to counter. That video is linked above. The name changes how you read everything that came before it. Start there.